In 2021, it can be hard to process the fact that vampires were once a genuine horror icon. Not just a Halloween costume, a genuine horror monster that terrified readers and audiences in the early 20th century. You know what a vampire is. We all know the iconic images of Mac Shrek as Nosferatu slowly creeping up the stairs, or Bela Lugosi's iconic performance as Dracula in the 1920s. These images terrified audiences, and they're still kinda haunting to this day. Even the concept of the vampire is really bleak when you think about it. There have been many interpretations of the vampire over time too. We have the gruesome Nosferatu vampires, the sophisticated aristocrats feeding on the lower classes, we've had heartthrob vampires, we've had comedy vampires, we've had all sorts of ways you can interpret this one monster. But there's one kind of vampire that I honestly still don't quite get, and it's a pervasive one. The horny vampire. It wasn't always like this, you know. One look at the British political landscape will show you that vampires haven't always been dreamy heartthrobs or sex symbols. The origins of the horny vampire, Jesus Christ, I can't believe I'm doing this, go back decades. Actually, while I was editing this video, I decided to Google horny vampire for a laugh, and I came across this 1971 film literally just called The Horny Vampire. I'm not surprised, like, horror was doing far worse stuff in the 70s. Anyway, I digress. The horny vampire is a trope that really only seems to get applied to the vampire though. Like, I'm sure it exists somewhere in the internet, but you don't get so many films and games where you're fighting a horny Frankenstein's monster or a horny mummy. And you don't get many horny zombies outside of Cannibal Corpse album covers. Look, like, basically I'm saying that modern interpretations of the vampire are weird as fuck. And it's not entirely schlock, well, I mean, it's mostly schlock, but lots of high quality art has featured the horny vampire. But I find the late 90s, early 2000s vampire schlock to be absolutely fascinating, because what happens when the culture that brought you Freddy Get Fingered and American Pie decides to dip its toe into the vampire? Well, you get Bloodrayne. Hey, I'm Heather, and welcome to Retro Relapse. Bloodrayne is a 2002 action game developed by Terminal Reality, a game developer founded in 1994. Their back catalogue mostly consists of movie tie-ins and shovelware shite. Although they did make the Blair Witch Rust and Par, which I do need to add to my to-do list. This to-do list will consume me one day, I swear to god. Bloodrayne was released for the PS2, GameCube, Xbox and PC, and an enhanced PC version was released on Steam not that long ago. More on that later. I have the GameCube version, and because I'm a dumb bitch, I didn't realise it was in Spanish. This isn't actually the first time this has happened. I still have my German copy of Disgaea 1 complete, although I'll be playing the PC version for this review. Bloodrayne was met with generally positive reception by critics at the time, averaging about 75% on Metacritic. The consensus at the time seemed to be that it was a fairly standard action game with some unique twists to keep things interesting. And yeah, sort of. Bloodrayne is a very much a standard action game for its era. It's a game that sold well enough, and it briefly spawned something of a media franchise. So there are people who played this game. They're just somewhat shy about it these days because, well, horny vampires and all that. I never played Bloodrayne growing up, probably for the best to be honest, but it was a game that was always on my radar. One of those games I saw on Blockbuster and would consider buying, but since my parents were reluctant to buy me anything over a 12 plus at the time, there was no chance they were going to let me buy the titty vampire game. Right, okay, so before we go into talking about the game itself, we should probably address the ways you can play it. As I said before, I'm playing the re-released PC version, mostly for the higher visual fidelity and the ease of access, but we really need to talk about this. Listen, raise your hand, and don't worry, I'm not angry, I'm just disappointed. Who the fuck asked for this? Don't get me wrong, like, I'm all about game preservation. Having old games available to play on digital platforms is an unambiguously good thing. More people than ever before are playing some of the classics of the past, like System Shock 2 or I Have No Mouth and I'm a Scream, but I'm not entirely sure Bloodrayne was on top of anyone's "God, I wish I could play that again" list. The re-release, named The Terminal Cut, advertises itself as an enhanced edition of Bloodrayne, allowing for higher resolutions and generally an ease of getting up and running on modern PCs. And this much is true. There were only a few technical hiccups throughout my 5-hour playtime, and it otherwise runs perfectly fine. I do have a few suggestions and our nitpicks. Okay, devs, listen up. When you're making a PC port of a video game, we do things a little differently over here. I know, those arrow keys look pretty tempting as a way to navigate menus, but we stumbled upon this really wild invention in the 1980s. It's called the fucking mouse. Seriously, this grinds my tits more than anything else when playing PC ports. Let us use the mouse to navigate the menus. This really isn't hard, I did this shit in Daggerfall. 30 years ago we even had a full genre aimed around using a mouse called point-and-click adventure games. Old-fashioned, I know. And while I'm at it, if you really hate mice that much, at least let me use the WASD keys to navigate the menus. This is seriously like some sub-basic stuff that really shouldn't have been an issue in the original release, never mind a re-release in year of our Lord 2020. Oh, and another thing. The next console game I see making me navigate the menus using the analog sticks and mouse is getting stabbed. But yeah, apart from that, the Terminal Cat is the definitive way to play Bloodrayne in 2021. It's also got better controller support too. Bloodrayne makes an interesting first impression. I don't know what your tolerance is for PS2 era pre-rendered cutscenes, but mine is pretty high, and I find these things charming. We see our protagonist, Raine, that's the red-haired vampire over here, hunting some vampires in the night while she's being watched over by some dudes in robes. These robe dudes express some interest in Raine, and then we're put to the main menu and, lads, I'm so sorry, but this is 100% my jam. Look, I'm pretty shameless with my aesthetic preferences. I'm a child of the mid-2000s emo era. I mean, fucking look at me. There's something about this edgy as hell menu, with its corroded text and its industrial rock soundtrack and the obligatory goth girl lips in the background. It's kitsch, it's gauche, it's aesthetically repulsive to civil society, and I'm so fucking here for it. This is one of Bloodrayne's main strengths. Aesthetically, it perfectly sums up the times. Back when it was still fashionable to stand the fuck out of Brandon Lee and spend most of your time listening to the 69 Eyes seminal 2000 goth rock album Blessed Be, and have arguments over whether Spike or Angel was a peak vampire BF. Oh god, I hate this timeline, I want to go back. Anyway, Bloodrayne's menu gives us an options menu which has the usual array of stuff. Subtitles, volumes, so on. But there's also a cheats function. Put a G-cup pin in that. Upon starting a new game, you're brought to the tutorial level. The one thing that really stuck out here to me is the setting. Vampire games have like one of a few settings they tend towards. You got your medieval or fantasy types and your modern day dark alley big city games and maybe some Victorian London too. The fucking bayou isn't something I was really expecting from a vampire game. It's not really a setting I have a real itch to explore, but it's also underexplored in games I think. You play as Ren, a red-haired half vampire, and you're taught the basics of how to play the game by your fellow vampire Mince. Mince? I don't know man, it's not quite the name I would go for, but I'm laughing so it's doing something positive. Once you're given control of Raine and watch some of the animations, you will come to a horrifying realization. Look, I'm gonna come out and just say it, Bloodrayne is jank. It is jank as fuck. Walking around in Bloodrayne never feels right. Combat in Bloodrayne never feels satisfying. Jumping in Bloodrayne is an absolute shit show. These animations and how the game loves to focus on how Raine is doing these weird superhero poses while the camera angle just barely catches the animation is adorable. This is prime PS2 cheese and like, it's bad, don't get me wrong. These animations are wank. But I'm so thoroughly in love with how bad all of this looks and feels. Something about watching how Mince opens these doors with her flying kicks and how it barely works, and then how it actually looks even worse during gameplay is breathtaking. It's hysterical, it's adorable. Character models in Bloodrayne are actually pretty good for the time at least. For 2002 they look pretty good considering everything is rendered in 3D. And in general, Bloodrayne looks really good when it isn't moving. The environments are serviceable, and the models are fine enough, but it's the art direction that really sells me on this game's visuals. But as I've confessed before, I'm utterly infatuated with early 2000s visual aesthetics. I love how this game looks. I love how games in this time kinda had to rely on some sort of art style to make them look visually interesting, as we weren't really anywhere near photorealism yet. Bloodrayne has a lovely gothic architectural aesthetic, full of dark swamps, snowy castles, and well-cluttered corridors. There is an obligatory awful cave section, but apart from that it's all pretty good. And then it starts moving. Look, it feels like I'm beating a dead horse somewhat, but I really can't put into words just how badly these animations work. The characters seem to disappear off the ground without any wind-up. Raine's attacks will just sort of happen and it doesn't feel like there's any feedback on it at all. Animations like the door kick just sort of seem to zip to where they need to be without any thought for where the character started. Characters seem to run way too fast, and the potential dramatic tension in any scene is absolutely demolished by these goofy looking bastards doing goofy looking things. That dramatic tension isn't exactly helped by the voice acting, which is...
Oh no, I hidden here when those things came. They can't get in without them holes.
Oof. I should start by saying that I really like Bloodrayne's soundtrack. It's this really cool industrial rock score that was all the rage back then, and it's great background noise. There aren't any particularly catchy tracks, but I am sitting here writing this while vibing to the menu theme. If you like this kind of stuff, you'll enjoy Bloodrayne's soundtrack. It was composed by Kyle Richards, who composed most of Terminal Reality's games, and he's done some supervisory work on big ticket games like Ghost of Tsushima and Days Gone. I can't find this soundtrack anywhere to buy. I could have sworn it came with a GOG release, but apparently not. It's a shame really. The voice acting on the other hand is something special. Very few games in the early 2000s could claim to have good voice acting or writing, so I can't really hold this against Bloodrayne, but there's something to be said about the stilted delivery and a sort of faux Joss Whedon style of writing that's blared over these images of characters' faces, as their mouths barely move a pixel a minute. A lot of what Raine says is obviously meant to be cool and edgy one-liners and witty banter, but it comes across as just adorable. The story starts with Raine and Mince going to a Louisiana swamp which has been quarantined due to a fatal viral infection. Is it just me, or do stories about quarantine just hit differently now? You're taught the basics of combat and exploration, which are all fairly two-dimensional and lack any sort of depth whatsoever. Rain has a host of vampiric powers which allow her to kick down doors, jump really high, and go into sort of proto-Assassin's Creed style eagle vision, which allows you to see where your objectives are in the distance. These are competent enough, and there's nothing really egregious about them, and your arsenal of abilities will slowly get beefed out as the game goes on, but there's never anything particularly groundbreaking or game-changing past the first act. The combat itself is, well, lads, this is awful. I'm always amazed at how, even 2 years into the PS2's life cycle, 4 years after Ocarina of Time, we still couldn't get our heads around lock-on targeting being the best way to conduct combat in a 3D setting. Rain has two types of attack, melee and ranged. Firearms range from your bog standard pistols and machine guns to rocket launchers later in the game, and the shooting really doesn't work that well. The lack of a lock-on button means that you never really have a full control over where you're aiming at. Rain will automatically target enemies, but sometimes she'll decide against shooting the dangerous foreground enemy, and she'll start targeting some shambling dickhead in the background with one or both of her guns, and as a result you'll end up having to run away and reposition yourself, hoping to god you don't get your face munched off in the meantime. You also can't really choose which weapons to pick up or drop at all, as far as I can see anyway. Rain will pick up weapons dropped on the ground, but if you pick up a lame pistol by accident, there is no real way to get rid of it without firing every shot from it, which is inconvenient because you can only ever fire 2 weapons at a time, aside from the larger guns. So shooting one gun will cause you to also fire another, meaning you're wasting bullets on a gun you actually want to keep. You could ditch the firearms entirely and resort to melee weapons, and dear god, how is this even worse? It's actually impressive. I've not felt melee combat this floaty, lacking in impact, and unsatisfying in decades. You may expect Rain to have a series of combos you can use, and, kinda. You unlock more powerful attacks as the game goes on, but there's no real combo list. You just have to hit the left mouse button a certain number of times. So there isn't any satisfaction hitting a really cool combo or anything like that. The lack of impactful combat is even weirder when you consider the fact that Bloodrayne is gory as fuck, especially for the time. Enemies will routinely give into a million bits or be dismembered, even running away for help if you dismember them and they're still alive. That's pretty grim, but I have to admire the sheer amount of blood and chaos that's left after a big fight. There's just bits of dudes lying everywhere, and it's thoroughly unpleasant in a very cathartic way. Rain can slow down time in order to dodge bullets because Max Payne was still real groundbreaking shit at the time, and she can feed off enemies to restore her health. This is actually cool because you'll never really have to run around looking for that one health pack you might have missed. Instead, maintaining a high amount of health is left up to the player. Also, whenever Rain feeds on someone, she can use them as a human shield and absorb bullets, and she can also return fire and get some free hits when she feeds. Later in the game, you'll get a chain which you can use to pull enemies towards you and feed from them. However, this will lead to you jumping on them while they lie prone, leaving you open to gunfire and melee attacks. This is all pretty nice, and makes the combat in Bloodrayne more dynamic and faster paced than it might necessarily seem at first. It's just a shame that the actual act of hitting an enemy with your blades just feels lifeless and weightless. It sucks because a year earlier, Devil May Cry released and proved that you can actually do a mixture of melee and gun combat, and if Bloodrayne had taken some tips from that game, then the moment-to-moment gameplay might be more bearable. Actually, this sounds really familiar. Titty vampires jumping around, feeding off mooks and engaging in really bad melee range combat, all the while an early 2000s industrial rock soundtrack blurs in the background.
What a scene, man! Hoo-wee! Then it is plop you out here like a naked baby in the woods.
It's only fucking Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines like, just without any of the impeccable writing, spot on dialogue, interesting storylines, interesting characterization, or depth. It's Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, but without any of the good bits, and just the awful combat. You know how the final third of Vampire, when you're running around endless combat tunnels and it's like the worst thing you've ever played in your life? Well, Bloodrayne isn't that bad, but it is approaching it. But don't get me wrong, it's like Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, but it's still something orbiting high praise, I think. Look, I love Vampire the Masquerade, it's my favourite role-playing game. I've got the books, I've got the dice, I love Bloodlines, I love this shit. I love vampire stuff in general, I think. I love Let the Right One In and Nosferatu and Legacy of Kain. I've watched all of Buffy and Angel several times. I had a cringy Twilight phase when I was 16, just let me live. I think what I'm trying to say is that Bloodrayne isn't necessarily a good game, but I kinda like it. It's difficult to explain, but I feel like I have some sort of nostalgic attachment to it, despite having never actually played it before. It just hits on so many little things that remind me of my time as an edgy gotham bitch, and it actually feels kinda cozy. It's like you're playing a game from my childhood. I actually had a similar experience with Harvest Moon It's a Wonderful Life. I didn't play that game until my 20s, but something about the graphics, the music, and even the font felt familiar to me. Bloodrayne is one of those games, although it is pretty gash, all things considered. Okay, so we're heading to Spoiler Town now. The story for Bloodrayne isn't all that great and it's more of a so bad it's good sort of deal, but I also would like to add a content warning to this part of the video. I've largely avoided showing footage of it right now, but Bloodrayne does feature a lot of Nazi imagery, and it does kind of touch on topics adjacent to the Holocaust. If you find that sort of imagery upsetting, I advise watching with caution or skipping to the point on screen. So, as I mentioned before, you play as Rain, assisted by, I guess, your mentor, Mince. You're both agents of the Brimstone Society, a secret society that deals with the occult. Rain is a half-vampire, I'm not entirely sure how that works, but yeah, here we are. You're sent to Louisiana to investigate this plague, which you find is due to these weird spider monsters called the these weird spider monsters. It's your job to kill them and send any survivors to a church where they can be kept safe. The voice acting for these survivors is also just way out there. I don't know if this is a thing that actually happens down south, but a lot of characters have a sort of butchered French in their dialect. This isn't something I've ever seen or heard before, so if anyone can tell me this is real, then I'd actually be super interested in finding out. After rescuing the survivors and heading back to the church, you're greeted with what may be the single funniest cutscene I've seen in a long time. The spider things just straight up vor Mince and the rest of the survivors, which is hysterical. But of course, before she gets eaten, the camera has a nice long stare at her butt, and I guess this is where we're going to have to talk about the sexualization in Bloodrayne. Thing is, right, it's nowhere near as bad as I thought it would be, at least on first inspection. Obviously, Rain is running around in the pissing rain in this skin-tight leather outfit, which honestly just looks really uncomfortable and I kinda feel bad for her. Rain is obviously the stereotypical boss-ass bitch, who don't take no shit and don't need no man, but it's honestly sparing outside of the aesthetics. Although when it comes to the aesthetic, every female character in this game, even the fucking Nazis, have jiggle physics, which just looks goofy as shit. Like, is she not wearing a bra? Why are they jiggling like this, when she hasn't even moved? It must be the wind or something, I don't know. Also, you know I told you to remember the cheats option in the menu? Well, Bloodrayne has a rather infamous cheat called, and I can't believe I'm about to say this, Jiggy Mode, which does exactly what you expect and just, god, the early 2000s were fuck wild. Still, it's nowhere near as bad as the likes of, say, Right to Hell Retribution or whatever. Stuff like this is why I think a lot of people played Bloodrayne, but nobody really wants to own up to it. The dirty bastards. Rain promises sweet vengeance for this character we've known for 20 minutes, and after a speedy chase, we're hit with our first boss fight. This boss fight, well, it's bad for a start, of course it is, fucking look at it. But it really epitomizes a lot of what makes the combat in Bloodrayne feel so bad. Not only is it hard to tell I'm having much of an impact on this thing, it's hard for me to tell exactly what is hitting me at any given moment. This is especially bad with late game enemies who will just sort of walk into you and your health will completely plummet. The aftermath of this fight is when Bloodrayne also takes a complete 180-degree turn in the overall plot. Rain gets chid with this rib she found, and suddenly there's this German guy standing over her, and now the game jumps forward 5 years, we're in Argentina and we're killing Nazis. I knew Bloodrayne had Nazis in it. Like, I've seen gameplay of those parts of the game, but I never knew it happened so suddenly. The viral infection thing is completely dropped. That first level in the swamp is basically forgotten about. Everything about the spider things, the virus, the dodgy accents, it's all gone and it's never brought up again. Instead, the focus is entirely on hunting down and killing these Nazi leaders. And I'm not entirely against it. Hunting Nazis is a victimless crime and you don't need to feel bad about it in video games. It's just jarring, and I feel like there had to have been a better way to more naturally transition us into the Nazi hunting. But I mean, all that said, it's still a Nazi hunting good time. You're here to get revenge on Wolf, the Nazi from the swamp, and the Brimstone Society has tasked you with killing a bunch of Nazi higher-ups. This works as a setup, I think. You're given 16 guys to kill, and as far as I'm aware, there's some sort of choice as to which order you kill them in, but it's a largely linear room-clearing affair. This is where Bloodrayne's combat actually starts to shine a little. You're put up against just so many enemies and it can be overwhelming. You'll need to know when to use your standard melee attacks, when to shoot, when to feed, when to throw grenades, and it's actually kind of fun for a bit, which I wasn't really expecting. There's no downtime either. It's a nice brisk pace and the checkpoints are never too far away, so there's encouragement to go a little bit crazy and experiment a little. But this is also where we're introduced to the occult element, because occult Nazis were a thing we really liked back then. As it turns out, the Nazis came here seeking the relics of the lost city of Atlantis, who this mad bastard priest declares are the true ancestors of the Aryan race, which, to be fair, is more coherent than actual Nazi race science. It also turns out that while they were here, the Nazis found these Daemites, and they're basically Deadites, but Sam Raimi's still alive, so the copyright hasn't quite run out yet. Turns out that, just like in real life, and spoilers for the year of 1942, but the Nazis are a bunch of knuckle-dragging dipshits who care more about aesthetics and couldn't arrange a piss-up in a brewery, and they are quickly losing control of the Daemite situation. You fight this battle priest in his metal podium, and you realise that Bloodrayne is just here for shits and giggles. It's daft, it's mad as a brush, just fucking look at this. It's good, clean fun, and a good excuse to kill some fash. Nice. Which is why it's so jarring when Bloodrayne decides to depict the actual violence the Nazis committed. Towards the end of this section, you'll start seeing Nazis throw men in these striped pajamas into a pit where the evil Deadites are, and this is where I had to step back a bit. The reality of the Nazi genocides is an evil on such a cosmic scale that it's honestly hard to get my head around, and you require a really deft hand to portray in any piece of art in any art form, which is why I think it has no fucking place in Bloodrayne. The fact that this game even makes you fight these poor souls infected with the Deadite virus and chop them to bits just makes me feel really uneasy. The Nazi lady who's in charge of this is also literally named Mengele. Like, are we really going there, game? Really? Ah, fuck, that threw me off a bit. After a brief boss fight with the evil Nazi doctor lady, we descend into the pit where they find the Deadites, and Bloodrayne spends the next half hour or so making me go through a boring cave, and is by far the worst part of the game. Now, cave sections are the worst part of any game. This is one of those obligatory sections that games apparently needed back in the day, alongside the sewer levels and escort missions. I'm not entirely sure why it took us the better part of 2 decades to understand that these levels are, for the most part, awful, but you can say what you want about episode 2's cave quest, at least there wasn't any platforming. Back in the early 2000s, it seems like we just couldn't give up on platforming. Every game, no matter the genre, needed some sort of platforming level or brief bits of platforming sewed throughout, and Bloodrayne is no different. You've seen how this lassie jumps, it's like she's on the moon. None of the jumps are too tight, so it's not the worst by far, but if you need to make any extra distance, you'll have to use the spin kick, which not only looks awkward but it makes it very difficult to perfectly plan your jumps. Say what you want though, but Bloodrayne does at least tie its platforming into the levels themselves. So many times I thought, where am I supposed to go? Only to realise I had to jump to a high window or whatever. It feels like there's a lot of potential with platforming as a vampire. I mean, Soul Weaver did it well. Maybe Bloodrayne 2 does it better? Who knows? So, you blow up the Daemites, find another piece of this Atlantean god, and escape the Nazi cave. Well done! It's here where the game jumps to the final act, taking place at a snowy castle in Germany, and by god, I love this. Snow is one of those things that just automatically makes any scene look infinitely better. A lot of this is probably because snow was really rare in the west of Scotland where I grew up. We get snow approximately once every 79 years, so snow always looks and feels special. Some of my favourite environments in games are snowy ones. Bully or Fable or Tomb Raider, it's just so good. Bloodrayne's snow landscapes are a really nice divergence from the foggy swamps and underground bunkers of the previous levels, all the while still maintaining that gothic art style. Top marks, lads. But we do see another turn in the story somewhat. We don't hear from the Deadites again, they're just sort of gone. Instead we get this clan of feral vampires who just show up out of nowhere. I'm starting to think of Bloodrayne as less of a single overarching story of 3 acts, and more of a Monster of the Week affair. Like, you can totally see these acts having their own subtitles, you know, The Phantom Vor, Attack of the Deadites, Revenge of the Tits, so on. But the feral vampires are here now, and they're led by this fella called Hedrox, who also wants this deity's body parts to become immortal or whatever. I'm not gonna lie, I stopped caring a long time ago. And then, out of nowhere, we get a mecha section. Lads, just bin this. It's shite. But it turns out Min's is still alive and she's a traitor. You beat her up and then she gets yeeted off the side of a cliff, but oh no, she was actually the good guy the whole time. And then she gets wrecked by the big bad. Rip. Needless to say, the story isn't paced well, and to say that its plot events and characters are poorly explained would be an understatement. Like this Hedrox guy, who's the leader of the feral vampires that just keeps stealing your kills, he just sort of appears out of nowhere. You have a brief boss fight, he runs away, and you run across a minefield and way hey, it's time for the final boss. And you win this fight in the same way you win every tough fight in the game. You activate your blood rage mode, go into slow motion, stand behind the enemy, and click the left mouse button to win the game. This massive deity thing looked really intimidating at first as well, until you realise you can just stand in the doorway and shoom. Bloodrayne gives the big bads a very edgy middle finger and then leaves. But the Brimstone Society aren't finished with her yet. Ooh. And that's Bloodrayne. After the credits, you're just sort of given a cold cut back to the title screen. You don't unlock anything as far as I'm aware, not even some concept art or like a movie viewer. I can't say I'm disappointed because I wasn't expecting much, but I can imagine this being underwhelming at the time. The menu theme is still a banger though. Bloodrayne's cultural footprint is actually surprisingly large. There were 2 further games in the series, neither of which I've actually played. There's also whispers of the series being revived with new installments, which will be interesting to say the least. But of course, the video games are just one side of the Bloodrayne coin. Let's talk about Uwe Boll. I need to be careful here because there's a non-0% chance that he'll challenge me to a boxing match, but Uwe Boll is probably one of the worst directors of the early 21st century. He's infamous for making some of the worst films ever made, including House of the Dead, Alone in the Dark, and of course, Bloodrayne. The first Bloodrayne actually had a theatrical release and managed to scrape back only $3.7 million of its $25 million budget. That's an eye-watering loss. Of course, with this massive financial flop and the lost tens of millions of dollars, there was obviously never a sequel and it died shortly thereafter. Nah, they made 2 more of the fucking things. I have no idea how this guy was given licenses for so long. This wasn't even his worst box office bomb. I've not seen the film because I value my spare time and my mental health, but maybe one day I'll sit down and watch it. Although that 4% on Rotten Tomatoes doesn't look promising. So, should you play Bloodrayne? Probably not, but not gonna lie lads, this is 100% my trash. It appeals to so many of my unique little tastes that I find it hard to at least not be charmed by it. You're probably not gonna have a great time playing Bloodrayne, but if you're a former goth kid with nostalgia for this kind of stuff, it may be worth playing if you see it for a few quid. It should entirely be consumed as a so bad it's good piece of art and not much more. Even at the time, if you wanted a decent vampire game you could go elsewhere. Well actually, could you? Obviously Soul Reaver 2 was always going to be there, and it blows this game out of the water. If you get an Xbox, you had access to Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which is great. But on the PS2, well, you pretty much had this, Legacy of Kain, Vampire Knight, and I think that actually might be it for 2002. Actually, you could make the argument that, at the time, Bloodrayne was one of the best vampire games around. Now that's a scary thought. So I guess, when you put it in its cultural context, Bloodrayne may not be so bad after all. Hey, thanks for watching, hope you had a good time. This was a very fun one to make. If you like what you see, give me a like, comment and a subscribe. Follow me on Twitter at BantsFerdinand and follow me on Twitch at BantsFerdinand. Hope you had fun and I'll catch you later.